what's great about every 911 from 64 all the way up to 2016, I've driven every one, even though they're all different, in a way they're all very similar because that DNA never changed. You know, that motor's been in that same position. I mean, to backtrack, there's only two other car companies that have manufactured a sports car continuously. Well, one's manufactured longer than the 911. Corvette came out 10 years before, in 54, I believe, or 53. And then the Ford Mustang came out same year, 64. And I always talk about the 911 and the Mustang, even though those two cars could not be more different. When you think of Ford, you think of Mustang. When you think of Porsche, you think of 911. Now, even though the Ford's water-cooled engine in the front, 911's air-cooled engine in the rear, what's fanatical about the connection between the Mustang and the Porsche, and not many people talk about it, I don't think, is the followers are fanatical. So the fans customize their own cars, but not only do the fans build and customize their own cars, so does the factory. You know, you can go to Ford today and buy a 6-cylinder Mustang, an 8-cylinder Mustang, a Shelby Mustang, a Parnelli Jones Mustang. So just like Porsche, the factory has many variations of that same car. For the first 30 years, pretty much everything is interchangeable. What a perfect example is the slate gray 964 there is actually running manual window cranks and glass out of a 65 912. And they dropped right in and bolted right up. No modification needed. So that shows that when Porsche engineered these cars 50 years ago, they did it right in the first place. You know, a lot of the parts on the first 30 years from 1964 all the way up to the 993 are somewhat interchangeable. So ultimately, that's what I love about Porsche is you can customize and modify. It's also what makes finding original cars difficult, because obviously as performance upgrades come along, everything that I just described, people tend to do. Want to go faster, stop quicker, things like that. So it's great to modify cars, but for example, with my early turbos, it's challenging to find one that's all original that hasn't been modified or went off the road backwards or got stolen or parted out or became a race car. Porsche introduced the 75 Turbo in 1974 at the Paris Auto Show. And they made 284 examples of what became the iconic 930 Turbo. Of those 284, if you come this way, this is a 1975 930 right-hand drive turbo. 41 years ago, Porsche made 17 of them for the whole world. I don't think there's more than 10 in existence today, because these early turbos were notorious for getting crashed very early, going off the road backwards, or if they survived that, they were notorious for being stolen and parted out, or if they survived that, people upgraded them or made them into race cars. So my 75 Turbo right-hand drive is also accomplished by a left-hand drive model of the same year. So I don't know anybody that has a left-hand drive and right-hand drive 75 Turbo. This is factory color with factory original interior. I haven't customized this car. With all my turbos, they're all essentially stock original numbers matching cars. The only thing I've done to them is essentially lower them and change the rims. So for me, I'm known for modifying cars, but probably half the cars that are in the garage are pretty much stock. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, it was all about the turbo. The iconic poster that you had on the wall as a kid, anywhere in the world in the 70s and 80s, chances are there were 3 posters. Porsche Turbo, Lamborghini Countach, Ferrari 512 Boxer. So, you know, I picked Porsche. And to sort of condense my rambling, you know, for me, it's all about the freedom to do whatever I want to do. So my goal in the collection is to have one of every model that Porsche has ever done in the 911. So far I'm up to 964. Next step will be the last of the air-cooled, the 993, and then obviously moving into more of the modern generation, which is 996, 997, 991, the water-cooled years. You know, some of those cars are now almost 20 years old. But I also have the freedom to want to experience everything Porsche has to offer that Porsche's ever made. So that's front engine water-cooled, which means 924, 928, 944, and 968. And then also mid-engined, air-cooled and water-cooled. So that's 914. And for me, the Cayman will represent the mid-engine water-cooled. So for me, it's all about diversity, and that's why I don't build customer cars. That's what separates me along from quite a few other things from a lot of the independent performance shops that are doing great work building their interpretation of their dream Porsches for customers. My latest build is the newest build, is a 964 right here, 1990. This I would describe as perhaps my most modified and performance-orientated build. But it's also pretty subtle because it's in one color. But underneath that skin, everything's been tweaked and massaged. The only two things that have unaltered on that car are the doors. From the front bumper, to the rolled fenders, to the louvered fenders, to the channeled narrower scoop on the roof, to the reset gas cap, to the rolled arches, to the rain gutter delete, to the integrated rear turn signals, to the turbo tail. We've reprofiled, and we've also put a center channel in it. You know, it's kind of crazy to reinvent the wheel. So what we did is we reinterpreted the classic Porsche Fuchs design. This was what we were inspired by, the classic Fuchs, and this was our reinterpretation. So stylized, but actually has hollowed out spokes. So we wanted to recreate a wheel that would appear that it might have left the factory in that same period. So, you know, the goal was to actually adapt a classic style, but tweak it and reinterpret it my own way, because that's what's defined me throughout my builds. So for me, this was pulling everything that I always loved about Porsche into one seamless package. So it's show and go. You know, it looks stunning, even though it's one color. It's kind of like the gentleman's build in a sense. You know, it's not a boy racer build. It's a performance-orientated build in an elegant color, just to sort of show, you know, my taste level is pretty broad when it comes to modifying Porsches. But from a performance point of view, this has got the most performance out of any car I've built. It's got the biggest motor with the most horsepower. It's got upgraded Brembo brakes and KW suspension. So it really is a performance-orientated build that I'm really proud of. Let me show you the back room. So I'm one of those guys that never throws anything away. As you can see, I'm fortunate enough to have the space. So this is the parts room, and that's my iconic 64 under there. And then just fenders and wheels and parts and everything else. This is the dirty parts room, which is essentially here exhaust and engine sheet metals and gas tanks and oil tanks and stuff like that. Back here is more of what I call the disorganized chaos end, where it's a little bit of everything. And I'm one of those guys that I don't throw anything away. You know, instead of having to go to a scrapyard and get a part, we essentially just come out here and pull them off the car. So let me show you. Talking a little bit about the unique roof feature on the 964. That is the buck. So what we did, because we didn't have a mold, we cut the roof off the 964, as you can see, and then just used that to make the pattern. And then that whole steel panel is made from 3 pieces of steel, welded into one, and then we cut out the entire roof, because that car was initially a sunroof car. And that was how we actually made the buck, to make that actual roof panel, which was then welded in one piece. So I like original stuff, but obviously sometimes you do need to get some remanufactured, new old stock original parts or reproduction parts. I've been fortunate enough to drive some pretty exotic cars from, let's say, the Porsche supercars, 959, Carrera GT, all the way up to the 918. I've been fortunate enough to experience those and to drive those. I don't necessarily have to own them. In a way, I think it's horses for courses. It all depends where you're going. For me, I'm fortunate that I live right around the corner and walk to work most days. So for me, 70% of my driving is pure pleasure. I don't commute to work. So if I was commuting from downtown LA to Santa Monica, which is 16 to 18 miles, and I've done this drive at 7 a.m. in the morning, and it can take an hour, I think that's where a 991 makes perfect sense. You know, because as great as my early cars are, if I'm not getting out of second gear and it's taking me an hour to drive 16 miles, that's not driving. That's a little bit miserable, because you can't get to experience everything I said that was great about the early cars. So I think, you know, I've positioned myself in life where I don't commute, so I don't necessarily need that practical car, but I've been fortunate enough to drive those practical supercars where you know, the performance is there and also the ease of driving is there. So I suppose for me, it's all about variety. And like I say never. I don't currently own anything newer than my 1990 964. But as I said, I'm on the hunt for one of everything. So to me, you know, it's not just purely 911. I want to experience, if it's got a Porsche badge on it, to me it's a Porsche. To a lot of people, the purists, they don't necessarily see the 914 as a Porsche because of its development alongside VW. So it's the first 914 that I've owned. I've obviously tweaked it a little bit, and it's a car that's not completely finished, but it's a car that I think has my personality already stamped on it. It's a first year Euro 928. I don't really want to modify it too much. To me, it's more about trying to see how it would be driving 40 years ago, and I'll own more than one, so one 928 will be modified. This one is basically just going to stay stock. It's a Euro sunroof delete 5-speed car. You know, at one time I wasn't purely Porsche. First car, you know, 77 Toyota Corolla. Second car, 88 Saab Turbo. Third car was my first Porsche, 1974 slant nose conversion. So back in the 90s, we had a lot of diversity. Now it's just purely Porsche, but back then we had a 65 GT 350R Mustang replica with a 351 Cleveland and a Richmond 5-speed with a Detroit locker. We had a 67 E-Type Jag. We had two 69 Super Bs. We had a 73 Lotus Europa, twin cam. We also had a 79 308 GTB Ferrari and several Porsches. And this was all probably between the early 90s and early 2000s. And to me, I use the word variety quite a lot. It was all about variety. We had our American muscle cars and our European sports cars, and it was kind of the best of both worlds. You know, and each one was kind of great at certain things. You know, the Mustang looked cool and, you know, drove okay, but didn't stop, you know, didn't really go around corners that well. 67 E-Type Jag, that's the iconic classic, perhaps the most beautiful, elegant car ever made. But that looked good, but didn't really drive good. You know, sometimes you'd park the E-Type for 6 months, not drive it, and you go, wow, why don't we drive that car? And then you'd get in it and something would break down and you'd realize, wow, I guess that's why we don't drive it. It wasn't super reliable. 69 Super B was great in a straight line. You could race anything, but you know, that didn't stop and didn't go around corners. 73 Lotus Europa was super nimble, lightweight, but here in LA, nobody ever saw that car on the road. It's about this high. So it was like a little go-kart. 79 Ferrari was kind of nice to drive, but every one of those cars compared to the 911, they were all sort of good at one or two things, but the 911 kind of excelled at everything, you know, and was just kind of the everyday supercar. So over a sort of 5-year period, I got rid of everything that was non-911 and realized ultimately, you know, that was the car for me. One of my favorite cars over here is the Irish Green 66, and next to it, a very, very early 65 911. This pair is actually a pretty good representation of original stock, modified original. So you notice this is more of what I call the Monte Carlo Rally spec, a little more racy. So if I want to step back forward, well, 50 years to 1966, we can't go back in time, but I can step into this 1966 911, and it's the appearance of driving something that's 50 years old. Both these cars are 50 years old, but they both drive differently because this one's mostly stock, this one's moderately modified. The Porsche thing for me is a hobby. Everything else is what pays the bills and affords me to have the hobby. A lot of the Porsches that I've owned, I bought, started 20, 25 years ago, so prices have changed over the past 10 years astronomically, so it wasn't like I was spending big money to get into these cars that have become, you know, a bit more valuable than they were when I bought them. To me, it was never about buying an asset that was going to go up in value. It was about, you know, ticking off the fantasy cars that I wanted to own. You know, it was always about feeling, emotion. That's how I purchase everything. Thanks to all you guys for tuning in and watching Mad About Cars. I'm Magnus Walker. Thanks for stopping by my warehouse in downtown LA in the Arts District. And like I always say, get out and drive, pedal to the metal, fast and smooth. So hopefully I'll see you on a road somewhere, whether it be here in LA or somewhere in Sweden or wherever you're watching this show around the world. So thanks for tuning in, thanks for supporting, and cheers and rock on. Let's get out and drive, pedal to the metal.